At least
So people don't feel the need to take a break.
we're good.
All
We're
right.
good.
Okay.
Good. Okay. Dr. Simeone received her PhD in anthropology from the University of Chicago in 2021. Her dissertation, Making Do in the Promised Land, Ethics of Ambivalence Among Chicago's New Africans, considers the sociological, economic, and political dimensions of migration between Francophone Africa and the United States in the wake of 2008 financial crisis. She has taught courses in ethnographic methods, social thought, the political economy of late capitalism, and human rights. Since the 1990s, she has been an educator, organizer, and political specialist in the fields of civil rights and international migration. Her current research investigates the impact of global finance, material infrastructure, and the politics of systemic crisis of human mobility. So let's all give Lisa a warm welcome for her presentation, The Future of History, Burundi's Present. Thank you.
Thank you, Sharon. I was hoping to be there in person, and it's so odd. Like, I see this, all I see is this empty podium, which is where I'm supposed to see. It's supposed to stand, which is sort of a strange experience. I guess there's no way that it could be turned so that I could actually see the audience. Well, I mean, whatever. I'm not that accustomed to speaking on Zoom, but I really wish I could be there today. And certain events made it impossible. But the pieces of the conference that I've been able to witness have been truly inspiring.
That better?
Yeah, that's much better. Thank you. Thank you. Janine asked me to share with you some of my thoughts about our extraordinary time together in Burundi. And I must admit that I'm only beginning to process that experience, and that these remarks are more impressionistic than rigorous. But I'd like to begin with a couple quotations. The two men moved off to set themselves down further on a knoll. All the events of the region passed before them. Public life was set out on the map, just as private life. Great politics make room for family life. The habits of cows, the hatred of men, the youth. There was no lack of time. They all had all day. For them, every day seemed alike. They lived. Priest and poet Abbé Michel Kayoya wrote these words in 1968, describing the days of his father from the vantage point of a post-colonial condition that was deteriorating into suspicion towards the government, towards the monarchy, towards the former colonizers and the neighboring countries, and towards political rivals of different ethnic groups. A few years later, the Abbé would lose his life in the 1972 genocide. Now I want to share with you a poem written by Melchi Boshira, a talented, expressive, ambitious young man of around 30 who served as one of our interpreters in Burundi. The poem is called Le Jour du Scandale, the Day of Scandal. It was written in French, and this is my translation. It begins, the eclipse of the sun took place. Misfortune of all colors covered my sacred place. The rooster was not singing as usual. The cars weren't running well, even on a paved road. The trees wailed, they reluctantly sang Hosanna. The animals in single file, dancing, cried hot tears. The rivers, the seas, and the oceans cried out for help. The mountains, plains, and plateaus prepared for the rancor of combat. The scene became a macabre spectacle. The yoke became a vernacular epidemic. All humans were suffering. They carried crosses. The cadavers were startled, sobbing, crying out loud. Between life and death, there was despair, fear, and remorse. Between anguish and joy, there was hatred and cruelty. No one dared express tenderness. The children of the same father were intertwined. People of the same ancestor killed one another. We greeted each other with machetes and clubs. We no longer slept in our beds, but hidden in the garden grass. The poem continues. It becomes more personal, a memory of chaos that strikes at the core of a child's world, and it drives him mad. It ends with this. On this day, Monsieur le Scandale, chanting series of shocks, of worries, made me sleep on my feet by offering me his dirty jewels and forced me to thank him. This day made my mother and my father suffer. This day ruined the peace of souls. It was a day of scandal. I had to sleep in my sandals. When Bouchira read this poem to us during his interview, he explained that the sandals that he speaks of in his last line are the soles of hardened mud that covered his feet from running into the fields. The pastoral dream of Abbe Kayoya's memory turns into a senseless nightmare for Bouchira. The hatred of men has disrupted the habits of cows, and children must sleep in the fields, trembling in fear. The order of nature is subverted. How does one recover from the day of scandal? Bouchira is asking. How does one recover laughter that is not deranged or sadistic or nihilistic? How does one heal from the suffering of one's parents and the ruined peace of souls? As an anthropologist, I was keenly aware that these are not questions that I could answer. I was approaching Burundi, Burundians, Burundian history from the other side of a border. That is, from the outside, with the limitations of my own cultural and racial, linguistic, and experiential subjectivity. As a scholar, I was hooked by the complexity of Burundi as an intellectual problem and have been satisfying my curiosity by reading across disciplines about the historical, political, and sociocultural dynamics that have converged there. As a teacher, I was blessed to embark on this journey with a remarkable group of students who taught me how to see and think about our shared experiences every day. If you missed their panel yesterday afternoon, I encourage you to watch the recording when you have a chance. They did a beautiful job, and I've relied on their observations to guide my remarks today. As a writer myself, I was quite moved by Bouchira's little book of poems, and I think they're quite good. They're lyrical, evocative, and true. They also speak a truth that I identify with experientially, not because I have lost family members to genocide, but because I felt the world become unsafe as a child. When my mother planned dissertation research in the early 1970s, she didn't know that Highland, Guatemala was a site of genocide. Indeed, it wasn't until I was an adult that I discovered the full extent of the dirty war that was going on all around us, but I felt it. In Burundi, I was often flooded by the effective memory of being in Guatemala during a parallel genocide during the same years that was perpetrated by another post-colonial government against its own people and funded by the US military. It was almost uncanny how I felt those years in the atmosphere of tension and sadness behind the genuine hospitality that greeted us wherever we went, especially in the highlands of Bururi, where we encountered the fraternity of Buta. I quote Jody Michalachki's summary of the event that took place there. On April 30th, 1997, during Burundi's 1993 to 2005 civil war, Buta Minor Seminary was attacked at dawn by a large armed force, ordered at gunpoint to separate by ethnicity, Hutus over here, Tutsis over there. Students in the senior dormitory chose instead to join hands and affirm their common identity as children of God. Over the next 4 hours, they fell to gunfire and a grenade. During this chaotic assault, as attackers moved in and out of the dormitory, able-bodied students bound the wounds of their injured classmates, carried them to safety, and listened to their final words. Dying students chanted psalms and they prayed the rosary. They made peace with God and their classmates. Several were heard asking God to forgive their assailants. Ultimately, 40 students were killed and 26 others were seriously wounded. As Barbara Jones mentioned in her introduction to yesterday's panel, there is still an underlying uneasiness present. How do we respond as scholars and activists and human beings to the trauma of others without succumbing to the paralysis of our own trauma on one hand, and the powerless sympathy of the distanced observer on the other? This question, which I'll return to at the end of my talk, was one of a number of questions which have haunted me for a lifetime that have organized my intellectual and emotional responses to our experience in Burundi. Why is Burundi so poor? Burundi is one of those countries that most Westerners have never heard of, though it's nestled beside its false twin, Rwanda, like half of a heart. The last 2 decades have seen significant improvements in health, education, and welfare for many African people, notably Rwanda, yet Burundi remains one of the poorest countries on earth. Genocide has a lot to do with this. As René Le Marchand has written, the 1990-72 genocide had far-reaching repercussions for the new country. Although the killings were intended to crush an insurrection, President Micombero had underlying objectives for orchestrating a bloodbath. First, to ensure the long-term stability of the state by eliminating all Hutu elites and potential elites, including school children. 2, to transform the army and the police into a Tutsi monopoly. 3, to rule out the possibility of a restoration of a monarchy. And 4, to create a new basis of legitimacy by projecting an image of the state as the benevolent protector of the nation against all enemies, internal and external. This 4th point is particularly important because it establishes the grounds for a politics of distrust that has been mobilized systematically to maintain political and economic control. Human geographer Patricia Daly has referred to this modus operandi as genocidal violence, a violence rooted in colonial biopolitics of race and hierarchy that manipulates identity to secure social and political control through state-sponsored violence. This control allows those in power to eliminate economic competition and maintain exclusive access to wealth. Daly pushes beyond the narrow legalistic definition of genocide to argue that the very structure of the modern African state is genocidal, and that structure is sustained by international arrangements of wealth and power. That means that all states are genocidal insofar as they are supporting the genocide in places like Burundi. I believe this is an important analytical move because it challenges the temptation to treat ethnic difference as naturally polarizing by asking what structural conditions rendered ethnic difference a productive source of political and economic exploitation. In fact, ethnicity is only one of the fault lines in Burundi society, and major political parties, even during the Tutsi-dominated period, were not ethnically exclusive. Yet ethnicity became a profitable logic of control for elites who had learned from colonial administrators to extract wealth and eliminate opposition rather than govern. This pattern of genocidal violence, termed necropolitics by Cameroonian philosopher Achille Mbembe, subjugates the people to a kind of living death without the national citizenship rights promised by a liberal democracy and without the international value to merit intervention. Now, I'm going to qualify that later, but right now, I want to keep in mind that the 1972 genocide not only decimated the Hutu intelligentsia, it also represented the systematic transfer of material wealth from Hutus to Tutsis. Of course, murder in the intelligentsia also eliminated Hutu human capital, undermining the capacity for most Burundians to participate in the proliferating capitalist infrastructure of neoliberal development. Not that that development project has been so successful, but it was a primary means for upward mobility in other countries, such as Rwanda. I am not going to dwell on political economy today, but suffice it to say, there's a lot to say here, but suffice it to say that Burundi's leaders have found it more advantageous to maintain a genocidal present, which attracts foreign exchange through military aid and exile remittances, than to leverage a genocidal past as a means of attracting foreign investors. In a recent, very personal and retrospective work, René Le Marchand describes a surreal meeting in 1973, during which the genocidal president Micombero pulls him aside to say, with all seriousness, that Burundi will have its own atomic bomb. Micombero was already aspiring to the modern genocidal state back then. Throughout his prolific writings, Le Marchand describes the consistent mismanagement of post-colonial Burundi, Rwanda, and the Democratic Republic of Congo by European and American diplomats, culminating in unquestionable support for regimes with a military muscle to keep the peace. Le Marchand mourns Burundi's lost opportunities, the assassination of the Tutsi Rwagasore in 1961 at the birth of the nation, and the assassination of the Hutu Melchior Ndaye in 1993 at the birth of the nation's multi-party democracy. The great tragedy of post-colonial Burundi, according to Le Marchand's story, was that these charismatic leaders, popular among both Tutsi and Hutu, were assassinated before they could achieve bi-ethnic governance. Yet, as Daly points out, perhaps the structure of the genocidal state has made such a political project impossible. Perhaps the modalities of liberal peace have only reinforced genocidal conditions for leaders who opt for political stability over justice. I thought of this when Sarah Dardell shared the image of the $10,000 franc note, or the $10 franc note, featuring the two martyred presidents together. Sarah noted that in today's Burundi, the assassinations are being commemorated, not the genocides that they implicated. Yet the genocide lurks behind these images and the money itself. Many of the most influential political figures in Burundi today were orphaned in the 1972 or the Civil War. One such orphan is the current president, Evariste Ndayishimiye, I can't pronounce it well, his predecessor's handpicked successor in an election marked by widespread electoral fraud. The 2018 Constitution has empowered the executive branch of government over parliament and extended the presidential term from 5 to 7 years. However, the international community doesn't really seem to care much about what happens in Africa, as long as frontier markets remain profitable for international capital. So my second question is, what is the truth? In a recent book about the earlier post-colonial period, historian Aidan Russell writes that truth was an idiom of politics in the 1960s Burundi, a proprietary language of political claim and debate. In his close study of Kirundi newspapers and political propaganda, Russell shows how the problems of politics were made explicit to the people through repetitive slogans, appeals, topics of conversation, and implicit rationalizations of power. For example, there were subtle differences of meaning when independence was rendered in Kirundi as ukwikukura, sorry, Janine, connoting freedom from domination, or as French indépendance, which referenced the European idea of liberal identity, or Swahili's uhuru, which emphasized Pan-American unity. As Ghanaian philosopher Kwasi Warigo insists, the words we use to render a common experience and common question leave subtleties of meaning that struggle to be recognized. In this regard, stories of suffering operate as idioms. They are universal truths insofar as all human beings experience suffering, but they are also particular to the storyteller, a person who is making sense of her own experience. In this spirit, I argue that we must take Abe Koyoya's lyrical memory of Burundi's pre-colonial landscape, which bears certain images that appear frequently in African literature: two men in peaceful contemplation, the organic integration of public and private life, the abundance of time, and above all, the fertility of repetition. Because they were in balance with the earth's rhythm, Koyoya seems to be telling us they were able to live in balance with each other. Like the truth of human rights, this story is oriented towards an ideal that transcends political struggle. According to historians, Burundi's pre-colonial era was characterized by often deadly competition among the Ganwa, the princes of blood, who were neither Tutsi nor Hutu, but encompassed both groups through their chiefly authority. The deeper truth of Abe Koyoya's story is not factual, but visionary. It demonstrates a way of thinking the past as a possible future. Because I could not speak or understand Kirundi, I could not pay attention to the ways that certain words reference entire chains of association. However, I participated in 2 French interviews in which culturally and politically potent tropes were operating. Institutional references located the speakers in time and in space, while a poetic quality conveyed a sense of ritual retelling. I don't know if these individuals, both successful, well-educated professionals with international experience, have told their stories many times before. My point is only that their stories are testimonies to personal and collective phenomena that are both subjective and objective, descriptive and interpretive, and that they bring as much complexity as clarity to the documentary record. Their meaning is not transparent. Of course, ritual repetition codifies the meaning of experience, as Sarah Dardells mentioned yesterday in her description of our visit to the Buddha Seminary. Father Zachary walked us through the seminary, reenacting, like the Stations of the Cross, the moment-by-moment unfolding of the students' martyrdom. As we followed him, we felt like we were participating in a script as witnesses to Father Zachary's sorrow and shame, but also as the means for the message of solidarity that his failure to protect his students made possible. He told us that he had been spared to tell the true story, which, as Sarah pointed out, is ritualized as a channel for all the other stories that can't be told. Jody writes that by the time of the students' funeral mass 2 days later, their solidarity had begun to turn the massacre into a triumph, as poignant victory of fraternal love over the ethnic manipulation of civil war. Thus, like Abe Koyoya's story, the story of Buddha offers a powerful vision for the future. Yet we must beware confusing the emotional truth of trauma with a factual truth that can somehow allow us to master the past. The performative power of storytelling can be mobilized as a stage for any form of political action. As politicians know well, the challenge is to keep one foot grounded in a critical position outside the action, even as we are flooded with sympathy for those who have suffered. So, my third question is, how do we break the patterns of trauma? Nasima Daoud put it beautifully yesterday when she asked of the boys of Buddha, their hands interlocked, how did they know how to stand together as children? The thought came to her, she explained, because it was unfamiliar to her, having been brought up to look out for herself. What was surprising to many of us was that Burundians who had grown up in the shadow of genocide had so much to teach us about being together. The young people that we met told us in no uncertain terms what they needed. They want freedom from fear. They want to stop running. They want to break the cycle of violence. They want to get on with their lives. Yet this is easier said than done. Jody's told us that the model of a trauma as an event that happens to an individual and reappears later doesn't apply well to cyclically traumatized societies. It appears to me that Burundi is suspended in an intra-traumatic rather than a post-traumatic moment. Unlike the Shoah, the repetition of mass murder is a recurring nightmare that has yet to be history. As Leslie Westerberg recalled in her presentation yesterday, there are still bullet holes in the buildings of Buta where children are learning today. Anthropologist Lisa Malky documents how the personal memories of trauma takes a collective form of myth in her 1985 ethnography in the Tanzanian camps where refugees from the 1972 genocide were still waiting in a liminal state between being selected for repatriation elsewhere or taking the risk on home. Malky describes how Burundians countered the humanitarian image of speechless emissaries in a miserable sea of humanity by sharing stories that reenacted their rights of membership in a nation. Malky calls for a radically historicizing approach to refugees and displacement, an approach that insists on acknowledging not only human suffering, but also narrative authority, historical agency, and political memory. This conclusion is absolutely consistent with our project in Burundi. Burundian truths must be told. Yet we must also proceed with caution. The problem with myth-making, however empowering in the short term, is its invitation to retaliatory violence. Burundi witnessed this as the country spiraled into civil war after President Ndaye's assassination. Today, that fear is a potent tool in the hands of a Hutu-led administration that is becoming increasingly authoritarian in its techniques of governance. There is no single act of reparation or memorialization that will suffice because change is a process involving all Burundians. And because entire generations are marked by violence and its repercussions, however unequal its impact, reparations are as much about redistribution as a recovery of what has been lost. For more has been stolen than can ever be repaid. And this is as true at the international level with respect to race and respect to colonization as it is to the micro example of Burundi. Memorialization is more about the collective recognition of common humanity than its convergence into a unified story. So when I entitled this talk, "The Future of the Past and Burundi's Present," I was referring to a time when that cycle has ended and the young people of Boshira's generation can sleep without their sandals. As Professor Eze told us yesterday, everyone has a story, and every story needs another story to make sense. We heal by seeking to save our common humanity. This means that a plurality of stories must coexist, even stories of contradiction with one another. I was taken with the image that Sarah shared yesterday of the wall around the Jewish cemetery in Frankfurt that commemorated each and every life that was lost. There is no public memorial to Burundi's 1972 genocide because the repression of that memory continues to serve the interests of those in power, both nationally and internationally. Fortunately, Burundians don't have to agree on the future of the past to share a present. In fact, they already are. What I found particularly remarkable is the work people do in their everyday lives to prevent violence. We met Burundians who may have been poor and they may have been afraid, but they were not a living dead waiting passively for another genocide. They were actively and often passionately making do with what they had, and they shared what they could with their visitors, most generously, the wealth of their stories. As G. Davis emphasized in her remarks, Burundians practice Ubuntu in their everyday lives. I am because we are all connected. How do we respond as scholars and activists and human beings to the trauma of others without succumbing to the paralysis of our own traumas on one hand, or the powerless sympathy of the distant observer on the other? I repeat that question. We listen and we engage, and following through on our commitments to the best of our ability without believing we know the answers. During the student panel yesterday, Susie Bonilla spoke from the perspective of a social worker with DCFS who works with children who are struggling with trauma. Having lost their sense of safety and self, these children often lack the ability to regulate their emotions and navigate their relationships. Expressing traumatic memories and sharing them with others who have had similar experiences can relieve feelings of shame and helplessness, but healing takes time. There are no clear-cut solutions, Susie told us, but if they take it one day at a time, they can eventually gain some control over their own responses to pain. She seeks to teach these children resilience. So in a political context, resilience has a cynical ring. It's what international development agencies expect of people in poor countries, while wealthy countries consume more than their fair share of the world's resources. Yet it's becoming increasingly clear that we are all connected. Global inequality will bring us all down if we can't learn to conserve our collective resources, share our collective wealth, and heal collectively of our trauma. Burundian resilience is a lesson to all of us that even as structural injustice, deeply rooted in the colonial violence of a Eurocentric past, devalues African lives, the everyday work of Ubuntu creates a better future in the African present every day. Thank you.
Thank
I
you.
can't. Oh,
Can
okay.
you hear us? Can you
Okay,
hear
I can
me?
hear you. Yeah, I can hear you now. Yeah.
Yeah, wonderful. Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. Really, really informative. I love how you really like, put the lenses closer to the youth, to the next generation, and what they could rather than focusing on producing the stories to relate to the past, but for the younger generation. That's really beautiful. And I love how you connected with our students' stories, presentations. That's just powerful. Thank you for doing justice to what's happening in Burundi and what it could be in the future. Let's see if anybody has questions here, in person or virtually. Do we have anybody? One here, Dr. Chieze.
Yeah, thank you very much for the wonderful lecture. My contribution is not so much a question as a kind of general comments, and I love especially your notion that memorialization ought to be, that you've discovered that the Burundians understand memorialization as a quest for their common humanity. And I think that's just in relation to what you also said earlier about the process of myth making. In myth making, memory often tends to be selective. And if it's not, if our mythologies do not intend to heal both the us and our enemies, then they will be really dangerous. So, well, you could comment on that, but I was also interested in understanding what you said about is that Patricia Daly's comment that is that colonialism sets the stage for genocide, or has colonialism has made peace among different ethnicities really impossible. So could you comment on that?
Sure, I'd be happy to. It's a common observation among scholars of African politics and history that the colonial that the colonies in Africa in particular were laboratories, right, for modern governance, that there were places in which people could be actively manipulated, intervened in, and controlled as labor, but also as sort of potential objects of future forms of governmentality. And so there, especially in Burundi and in the Belgian colonies, decolonization was sudden and reluctant, which means that no infrastructure was put together for a new generation of leadership to take charge. There was a real vacuum of power, which, as we know, resulted in just decades of civil war in the DRC, and we saw that in Burundi as well, as leaders found that the Belgian way of ruling was perhaps more effective than the sort of visionary multi-party democracy, the kind of vision, not even multi-party, multi-authority, a kind of democracy that was African in its inspiration, right? That came from that tradition of contemplation, that came from drawing on the wisdom of elders, that came from accountability to one's own local network. The visionaries like Lumumba and Rwagasore were very creative about what modern governance might mean in an African context. But the Western powers didn't want to see true independence from Africa. Arguably, they still don't. Africa has been a source of extraction of natural resources, but also of human capital and of ideas for many, many decades now. And it's really Africa's moment is coming in which it is going to set the stage for a future global organization of power. I actually believe that. But Burundi is a place that has been neglected because it was advantageous. That neglect was advantageous, much as the colonies were neglected as true sites of self-governance during colonization.
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, this is just perhaps not necessarily a follow-up, but a general question. I've been so interested in the South African peace process, and one of the contentious concepts or notions that South Africa introduced or made introduced to the global dictionary of peace is forgiveness. So do you think that this notion can gain traction, or is it being practiced? Is it being bandied around in Burundi?
That's a great question. That's a great question. And I don't really know if it's being bandied around in Burundi, though I would seriously doubt if it served as a politically useful idea, given the fact that we now have an increasingly authoritarian government that is gaining traction through a politics of retribution. At least some observers are concerned about that. However, I believe that forgiveness is practiced every day in Burundian society. I mean, people live with people that were perpetrators of violence against them and against their families. And this is something that has been observed in Rwanda as well, and in many other parts of the world in which there was divisive violence over generations. People live with people because that's what we do. We're social beings. And arguably, peace in Burundi is going to come from the bottom up, not through some sort of political initiative. It's going to be a decision on the part of young people that have suffered enough. And that was the hope that we came home with. We saw this in young people. We have to find new ways of doing things. And it may not be our generation, but we're coming to a point in many parts of the world, including in this country, in which the way that we've done things since 1945, when the New World Order came into its own, they're just not working anymore.
Thank you so much. Please help me thank Lisa again.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for having me.
Hi, Lisa. Thank you so much. Please feel free to stand up and go grab something. There's still lots of food and other refreshments.